Blazing Saddles is regarded by many film lovers and critics alike to be one of the most iconic comedies ever made. It's widely considered to be one of the best examples of movie satire. Mel Brooks' highly esteemed classic is a Western comedy film that parodies and satirizes the traditional Western genre, as well as American society's social and political issues like racism, corruption, and bureaucracy. It features a talented cast including Gene Wilder, Slim Pickens, Cleavon Little, Harvey Korman, and Mel Brooks. In this video, we'll discuss how one of the film's most beloved and memorable lines was almost not included in the final film. Mel Brooks was leery of including racial epithets. Brooks was reasonably quite wary of including so many epithets being uttered by white characters when developing Blazing Saddles, but his co-writer, Richard Pryor, and actor Cleavon Little were able to convince him to stay the course and include them anyway. Throughout the writing process, Brooks kept asking Pryor and Little if they were going a little overboard, especially when it came to the liberal use of the N-word. He was worried not only of upsetting audiences, but getting in trouble with the studio and its censors. Pryor replied to Mel after expressing his concerns by telling them that if the racists and quote-unquote bad guys use that kind of language, then it's fine. But if good people start using it, that's when you know you've stirred up trouble. The infamous no parking scene. Film fans will fondly remember the following scene from the film quite well. When the brutish Mongo parks his trusty horse in a no-parking zone, he gets confronted by a fellow horse rider. Mongo then casually walks over to him, cool as a clam, and decks the horse. In doing so, he knocks them both abruptly to the ground. Evidently, Brooks didn't simply pull this bit out of thin air. It's said that it was inspired by a real-world story that he once heard from his former boss, Sid Caesar. Despite how uproariously funny Mongo's horse clobbering scene was considered, some audience members found it to be tasteless and inappropriate. Animal rights groups in particular were up in arms over the perceived mistreatment of the equine. Fortunately, in reality, no horses or any other animals were harmed in the making of the film. Gene Wilder had to step in for the Waco Kid. In the first round of filming, the Waco Kid was originally played by actor Gig Young. During the filming of an early scene, the Waco Kid was hung from his bunk while heavily intoxicated before proceeding to berate Bart. After viewing the scene, you might justifiably assume that Young was a phenomenal actor for acting drunk and belligerent so naturally. But in reality, he really was that drunk, so much so that the production had to be stopped. Gig was then effectively given the boot, and Gene Wilder was called in to swiftly replace him. Several years later, Gig filed a lawsuit against the studio for an alleged breach of contract. Slim Pickens was dedicated to his craft. For a comedy flick that involved farting cowboys, some of the stars who appeared in it took their respective roles quite seriously. One of these dedicated and hyper-focused stars was Slim Pickens, who desperately wanted to truly embody Taggart, the leader of the bully gang who ceaselessly worked to terrorize Rock Ridge citizens. Slim decided that in order to really get into character, he'd sleep outdoors like a real cowboy. He also slept with his Winchester tucked under his arm, reminding him constantly that he was supposed to be a big, bad, tough-as-nails outlaw. Mel Brooks was a bit of an outlaw himself. Lo and behold, Sheriff Bart wasn't exactly the most popular figure in town. Astonishingly, in order to be set free by the townsfolk, he ended up holding a gun to his own head. Initially, Brooks got the idea for the scene from something that supposedly happened in his childhood. As a young boy, Brooks apparently attempted to steal a water pistol and a pack of chewing gum from a local store. When the shop clerk attempted to stop him, Brooks claims to have pointed the quote-unquote gun at him, threatening that he was more than ready to pull the trigger. Warner Brothers weren't initially impressed. Warner Brothers had high hopes that Mel Brooks could capture the same kind of film magic that he produced when making his previous film, The Producers. But after the studio brass were treated to an early screening, all that one could hear in the room were those proverbial crickets chirping. The film was poorly received, and the studio was worried that audiences would find the movie to be as unfunny as they did. Not letting their cold response hold him back, Brooks remained confident that the film would do well and that they simply needed to trudge forward with their plans to unveil it to the public. Eventually, Warner Brothers agreed, and they ended up being happily delighted to be proven wrong, when early audience reactions were nothing short of enthusiastic. Warner was a bit stingy. Before the film's release, Brooks was put into the difficult position of having to convince the studio about the film's commercial and critical potential. The head of distribution at Warner Brothers told him the film was too vulgar for American people and floated the idea of dumping it and, quote, taking a loss. At this point, Brooks likely was starting to get quite nervous. Enter John Cayley, the president of the studio at the time. After reviewing the film and hearing Brooks out, he decided the film should initially be released in select cities. These included New York, Chicago, and LA. By the end of the summer of that year, the film not only had been released to theaters across the country, but it also had become one of the studio's biggest blockbusters. Football royalty made up a large chunk of the cast. Harvey Korman's character Hedley Lamar may have failed in his efforts to remove Sheriff Bart from his post with his ousting of Mongo. However, Alex Karras was one of the most successful and popular football players of his day. He played in the NFL for 12 seasons. He was part of the NFL's All-Decade team in the 1960s and was an All-Pro 9 times. It was only after leaving the Detroit Lions behind that he decided to pursue a career as an actor. His first notable credit came when he joined the cast of the sitcom Webster. The Line That Almost Wasn't. The comedy was iconic for all of its witty one-liners and hilariously written exchanges of dialogue, but there was one line in particular that stood out. After the townsfolk showed vitriol towards Bart, Waco Kid consoled him by saying,
"You gotta remember that these are just simple farmers. These are people of the land, the common clay of the New West. You know, morons."
The last bit of the line was ad-libbed, and the spontaneous improvisation caused Cleavon Little to lose his composure and erupt in laughter. Without taking liberties with that line, the world could have been deprived of one of the most memorable and hilarious bits of movie dialogue of all time. The cutting room floor. Mel Brooks wasn't afraid to push boundaries when it came to his signature brand of edgy comedy. This was to the delight of everyone with half an ounce of a sense of humor, but it deeply worried the studio, who were concerned about profit. Warner Brothers urged Brooks to cut several scenes, but he only ended up omitting the most risque and scandalous one. The scene in question involved Bart and Lily Von Stoop alone together in her dressing room. As she attempts to seduce him, she blows out a candle and asks him if it's true, quote, what they say about you people. Bart snapped back by saying, "I hate to disillusion you, ma'am, but you're sucking my arm." The film increased the sales of Raisinets. At the end of the movie, Harvey Korman made a stop at a movie theater concession stand. There, he ended up making the somewhat questionable choice of buying a box of Raisinets. According to Brooks, this scene led to an unprecedented increase in the sales of the candy. When interviewed by Playboy in 1975, Brooks said that after mentioning Raisinets in his film, the manufacturer of the chocolate-covered raisin candy proceeded to send him a shipment every night. Now it's time to hear from you. What's your favorite scene in Blazing Saddles? What's your favorite Mel Brooks movie? Let us know in the comments section below.